Video, we're going to do a quick whirlwind tour of three major ethical and moral theories in philosophy. They are probably the most three commonly adopted by philosophers, and we're going to briefly look at them because my goal here is not to give you an expansive and extensive knowledge of how each of these theories works and the insides and outs of them, but rather to give you an idea of the approach that they take towards bioethical questions, and in particular, what the differences between them, why they present different ways of looking at the same moral dilemma, such as the Mrs. Smith case. So we'll start off with consequentialism and then go to deontology and finish with virtue ethics. Consequentialism is a moral theory that posits that the morality of an action is determined on the consequences or based on the consequences that it produces. More specifically, it is how much happiness that it creates or how much pain and suffering it reduces. It operates on something called the greatest happiness principle, which is act such that your action produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. So to see this in action, we can take a look at the Mrs. Smith case, right? Mrs. Smith is older, her health is failing, and her doctor thinks that she ought to be committed to a nursing home. She does not want to go. She wishes to remain in her home and thinks that she will be just fine on her own. So when we're trying to decide whether or not we should commit Mrs. Smith to the nursing home, considering this, if we consider that it might be our choice in this case, a consequentialist is going to look at the consequences that either of the actions produces. So there seems to be two different choices here, right? One, we commit her to the nursing home, or two, we let her stay in her home by herself. And the things they might consider are things like Mrs. Smith's desire to remain put, or the possibility of how much suffering she is going to endure if she doesn't go, right? If her health is continuing to fail her, she might continue to deteriorate and her condition might continue to deteriorate, and she'll have a lot more pain and suffering if she doesn't go. We might also consider things like the doctor's well-being, right? Like this is going to be a minor consideration, but maybe the doctor's a real worrier and she's going to worry if Mrs. Smith doesn't go, and she's going to constantly be thinking about it and checking up on her. We could also, even to make this more complicated, think about if Mrs. Smith has family, the type of pain and suffering that they might go through, or their happiness, their well-being, if they have to go and take care of her, or if they want her to stay put and want her to be able to fulfill what she desires. You can see the types of considerations here that consequentialist is going to look at, though. You can think about the various well-being, the happiness, or the reduction of pain and suffering from other people. Consequentialism generally has pretty broad appeal, and we saw from the text that there are several different versions of it, right? There's rule utilitarianism or rule consequentialism, and preference consequentialism. I don't think it's important for our purposes to go through too many of those variations and try and differentiate them, but we can see the motivation for these by looking at some of the common criticisms of utilitarianism or consequentialism. I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably for our purposes. There is maybe a slight way to technically differentiate them, but we don't need to do that here. So one criticism that is common about the generic form of consequentialism is that it's really hard to predict the consequences that our actions are going to have. Predicting the future is hard, it turns out, and especially when there are complicated moral dilemmas, there's often a lot of factors that go into thinking about the consequences. In the Mrs. Smith case, even a very simplified version of that case, we have Mrs. Smith's well-being, the pain and suffering of that she might have if she stays home, her well-being in the nursing home, the doctor's state of mind, the family's state of mind. All of these things are part of the prediction that the consequentialist has to make. And how likely is it that they're going to be right about the future state of the happiness of Mrs. Smith, or the happiness of the doctor, or the happiness of the other family, right? That's a lot of predictions. And not only that, it's going to take the the consequentialist a long time to make this decision. They have to weigh all of these factors against each other in addition to making a future prediction about the state of affairs given a certain action that they take. So this criticism actually leads to rule consequentialism. The rule consequentialist, to see the rule consequentialism, we can look at like another case. So you're a kid, you're a teenager, young adult, and you are going out to a party on a Friday, right? And maybe your parents are strict and don't allow you to, don't really like you going to parties. Perhaps you're weighing up whether or not to lie to them about your destination. And you go through all the things like, am I going to get in a lot of trouble? What if something bad happens and my parents don't know where I'm at? Et cetera, et cetera. And you make a decision. Maybe you make a decision to be honest and, fortunately you get to go anyways or whatever. Well, turns out you have a party next weekend too. And all of the same factors that went into that original dilemma are again coming up in this similar situation. The rule consequentialist says, look, we don't need to go through all of those calculations and all of those predictions again. We can just rely on the judgment that we made last time because it's a similar situation and produce a rule out of it. Don't lie to my parents about my destination when I'm going out. Maybe that's a good rule of thumb that you can use in those similar types of situations. So rule consequentialism says, look, we don't need to look at every particular situation. We can group them into, say, types of situations and formulate rules about those. Another normative theory is deontology. This is often associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant. In contrast to consequentialism, deontology says that the morality of actions is not based on the consequences that those actions produces, but rather it's based on a set of rules. And specifically for Kant, this ends up as a result of duties that we have. There's two principles that are key to understanding this Kantian deontology. One is the categorical imperative. So an imperative is a command. It's like, do this, drink water, eat food. And categorical is in this context, it means that it applies universally. It applies to all rational beings, all human beings. And the categorical imperative ends up being act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. What does that mean? It means that whenever you're going to do something, think about the maxim of that situation. So if I'm about to cut to the front of the line, the maxim is cut to the front of the line. In order to do this and it to be considered a moral action or the right thing to do, it should be such that if everyone else were to cut in line, then the world would be all right. But of course, this is not okay. If everyone cut to the front of the line, it would be chaos. And not only that, but cutting to the front of the line would no longer work, right? So instead, you realize that action is morally wrong because you cannot will it to become a universal law. You could see this with lying too, right? If you think it's okay to lie, can you will it to be a universal law? No, because not only would everyone else lie, but communication would be fraught with misunderstanding. It would be almost impossible to communicate if people were always lying, right? So the other key to understanding Kantian deontology is the respect principle. This is that humans should never be treated merely as means, but always as ends in themselves. What does it mean to treat someone as merely as means? Well, it means to use them irregardless of their ends, irregardless of what they want out of life or what their desires are. It's not just using people. That's important to realize here. They talk about this in the text, but it's important that it's not merely using people because we do this all the time in some sense, right? Like you guys are using me to get credit for this course. I am using you to teach philosophy and to get the paltry salary that I do, right? We use restaurant staff to get food. We use, everyone uses each other, but that's not the type of means that Kant means here. He means that you can't treat someone merely as a tool to get what your end is. Exactly when this changes from merely as means to as means is really tough, but we don't need to go over that here. It's just important to realize that this is a key to understanding the reasoning behind deontology. In contrast to consequentialism and utilitarianism, decision-making in deontology seems a lot quicker, right? We just have rules and duties that apply to us as moral beings, or as rational beings, rather, and we act in accordance with those. How do we find them out? Well, the categorical comparative starts us on that road to finding stuff out, right? It's sort of the golden rule, as it were, for determining whether or not you ought to act in a certain way. Well, can I will that it become a universal law? If not, I shouldn't do it. And that ends up being a lot cleaner, or at least a lot faster, than the consequentialist moral decision making. That's all for the Unit 1 video. I wanted to make sure it was short, but it ended up being a lot shorter than I thought it would. But I think that's okay. For our purposes, you don't need to know the ins and outs of these moral theories. Believe me, you could spend an entire graduate course on any one of them. All I need you to know is the bare bones and the major differences in approaching ethical decision making. And I think that's going to be more than enough for what we're going to be doing in this course. So don't expect the other videos to be quite so short, but a nice short one to start you off and get your feet wet in philosophy of bioethics. Well, looking forward to the rest of the course with you. See you in the next video.